Mom's funeral was supposed to be mine. Not the grief, I owned that fully, felt it in my bones, carried it in every breath. But the role, the authority, the voice that mattered. I was her daughter. I was supposed to be the center of everything that followed, the one people looked to for answers, the one who carried forward her legacy. Instead, I stood in the back of the living room while my brother Alexander took the front like he'd been crowned for it. He was 3 years older, which apparently meant he'd inherited some divine right to decide everything without asking anyone, especially not me. I watched him guide people through the house like he'd been managing funerals his entire life, moving with confidence, speaking with authority, touching people's shoulders with practiced sympathy. When Aunt Helen asked what Mom would have wanted regarding the service arrangements, Alexander answered without hesitation. When Cousin James asked about the timeline for handling her belongings, Alexander answered again. When distant relatives wanted to know about the reception, Alexander had already decided. No one looked at me. They didn't even seem to notice I was standing there in the corner, listening, watching, realizing that something fundamental was being taken from me. That's when I understood it wasn't neglect or oversight. It was intentional replacement. My brother had simply decided, without discussion, without asking, without any consultation, that he was in charge, and grief had made everyone too emotionally vulnerable to question him. "You remember that camping trip when you were 8? Alexander said to a group of relatives gathered in the living room. His voice gentle, almost kind, designed to make people feel comfortable. "You were so scared of the dark. You cried because you couldn't get the campfire started. I had to do it for you, remember? You were just too little to handle something like that." Everyone smiled at him fondly, nodded knowingly, like they understood exactly what he meant. They believed him completely. They believed him because he was calm and confident and his voice was steady, because grief had lowered everyone's guard, made them soften toward easy narratives. But that wasn't how it actually happened. That memory was completely twisted. I remembered that camping trip with perfect clarity. I was the one who started that fire. I'd gathered the kindling, arranged the wood correctly, struck the matches with my own hands. I'd felt proud of myself. Alexander had been the one struggling with his tent, frustrated and cursing under his breath. I opened my mouth to correct him, to set the record straight, but the moment passed too quickly. Someone started talking about Mom's favorite flowers, and the conversation shifted away entirely. I realized then what was happening with crystalline certainty. He wasn't just taking charge of the logistics. He was rewriting me. He was changing my memories, my identity, my place in our family's story. And no one was going to stop him because everyone was too busy mourning, too emotionally exhausted, too willing to accept the easiest narrative. "Natalie is so strong," people kept saying to each other within my hearing. "She's handling this so well." But I heard what they actually meant beneath those words. Their tone was different when they said it. It was code for something else entirely. Something like, "Don't worry about her." Something like, "She doesn't need anything." Something like, "She can take care of herself." Alexander had planted that seed somehow, without me even realizing when it had happened. Every time someone pulled me aside with soft, pitying eyes and softer voices, I heard what my brother had already told them. That I was reliable, yes, but in a way that meant I didn't need looking after. I wasn't fragile like Mom had been. I wasn't vulnerable like people expected grief to make me. Alexander had weaponized my strength, turned it against me, transformed it from a quality to be admired into a reason to exclude me from decisions. He moved through the house making choices. About the funeral service. About which flowers would be displayed. About what music would play. About what would happen to Mom's clothes, her jewelry, her books. And each time he made a choice, he thanked people for supporting his vision, thanked them for helping, thanked them for being there. He never asked me once what I wanted. He never consulted me. He never even told me what he'd decided until after he'd already decided it. By evening, I understood completely that my brother had spent the entire funeral day taking everything that was supposed to be mine, systematically stripping away my role, and somehow everyone thought he was being helpful and generous. By the time people started leaving around 9 o'clock, all the major decisions had been finalized without my input. Alexander would handle the legal paperwork with the lawyer. Alexander would coordinate with the funeral director. Alexander would manage Mom's apartment and her accounts until we decided what to do with them. Alexander would be the point person for any decisions going forward. I hadn't been consulted about any of it. I hadn't been asked what I wanted or what I thought. And worse, no one seemed to think that was strange or wrong. When I finally tried to speak up as people were putting on their coats, when I said, "Wait, I think we should talk about how we handle things," Aunt Helen gently put her hand on my arm. "Not now, sweetheart," she said with infinite kindness. "You need to rest. You need to take care of yourself. Alexander has this handled. Let him help you." That phrase, "not now," would haunt me for weeks and months. It was a weapon disguised as kindness. It was a gentle way of saying, "Your voice doesn't matter today. Your timing is wrong. Your input isn't needed right now. Maybe it never will be." I went home that night feeling hollowed out, feeling erased. Something massive had been taken from me, something fundamental to who I was in my family, and no one had even announced it or acknowledged it. It had just happened while we were all too sad to notice. The next morning my phone filled with messages. Long detailed messages. Explanations wrapped in gentle language and careful phrasing. "We wanted to give you space to grieve in private. We thought it would be better if Alexander took the lead since you seemed a bit overwhelmed by everything. Everything will be decided together eventually, but just not right now while emotions are fresh. Alexander is so organized, we're lucky to have him." The phrases were almost identical in different messages from different people. Variations on the same theme. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time with absolute certainty. Alexander hadn't just spoken for me at the funeral. He'd gotten to people first. He'd shaped their understanding of the entire situation before I even had a chance to defend myself or tell my own version of events. I replayed the funeral in my head obsessively that night. Every interruption he'd made, every correction he'd offered, every moment he'd smoothly taken over while I stood there. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't just grief making him step up. It was practiced, deliberate. He'd done this before, maybe many times, maybe his entire life. And this time, with Mom's death as the perfect cover, he'd finally done it completely, taken everything. I realized with growing horror that I'd been outmaneuvered before I even knew we were playing a game. Over the next week, I listened carefully to how people talked about what had happened. They told the story like it was already settled, like the narrative was locked in place. Alexander handled the funeral beautifully. Alexander has been so responsible and thoughtful. Alexander is being so considerate of everyone's feelings. We're so lucky he stepped up. No one mentioned me in any significant way. Not as a failure, not as someone equal to the situation, not as someone who should have been involved. Just as absent. That was actually worse than if they'd criticized me. If they'd said I was incompetent, I could have fought back, could have proven them wrong. But they'd simply written me out of the narrative entirely, erased me from the story of what happened. I started noticing how Alexander referenced things casually that I supposedly didn't know about. Legal terminology, details about accounts, confidential information, decisions about Mom's belongings that affected me directly. He'd say things like "we decided," but the "we" never included me. When I asked gentle questions trying to understand, he brushed them off with charm and a smile. "You'll understand once we get through all the paperwork, it's boring stuff anyway," he'd say. Or, "I didn't want to burden you with all these tedious details while you're grieving." Everything he said reinforced the idea that I was too delicate, too emotional, too unsuitable for the real work. And everyone believed him completely. I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped reacting. I stopped trying to correct him when he lied. I stopped trying to defend myself. I stopped being emotional about it. Instead, I started watching him. Really watching. I paid attention to what he said when he thought I wasn't listening carefully. I documented conversations in my phone immediately after they happened, writing down exact words and phrases while they were still fresh and accurate. I noted dates. I recorded what he said to different people, watching how his story shifted and changed depending on who he was talking to. With Aunt Helen, he emphasized responsibility and burden. With my cousin Alexander, he emphasized control and decision-making. He was different people depending on his audience, and everyone believed all the different versions. He was an actor playing the role that worked best for each person. I realized that if I wanted to survive this, I couldn't fight him with emotion. Emotion was what he wanted. Emotion would only prove his narrative about me being unstable and irrational. So I became silent, became observant. I became dangerous in the way that only someone with real information and evidence can be dangerous. Confidence makes people careless and sloppy. About 2 weeks after the funeral, Alexander started revealing things he assumed I didn't know about, things he thought I wouldn't understand, timelines that didn't quite match what he'd said before, details he'd mentioned differently to other people. He'd reference conversations he'd had with the lawyer, then later describe that same conversation completely differently. When I gently asked for clarification, trying to understand, he laughed it off casually. He used charm like a weapon, deflecting every question with a smile and a joke. But that charm only worked on other people. On me it did something different entirely. It confirmed what I'd already started to suspect. He believed he'd already won. He believed the narrative was locked in place permanently, that everyone's minds were made up about who he was and who I was and what happened. He didn't see that I wasn't trying to convince anyone anymore. I wasn't fighting for my place. I was just collecting evidence methodically. And every single time he talked, every time he explained himself, he gave me more. 3 weeks after the funeral, I asked Alexander for copies of the paperwork. I said it casually, like it was just something I wanted to review for my own understanding, like it didn't matter much. He hesitated for just a second, barely noticeable, but I caught it. Then he agreed, handed them over, acted like it was no big deal. When I got the documents home and read through them carefully, nothing was immediately dramatic. There were no smoking guns jumping off the page. But there were language shifts, subtle ones that most people wouldn't notice. Clauses written as temporary that were actually permanent in their effect. My name appeared in earlier versions where it used to be listed prominently, replaced with his name, justified as efficiency, in a single line of explanation. Everything was technically legal. That's what made it so dangerous. It was all technically legal, which meant he could defend it easily if I ever called him out. I didn't react when I found it. I didn't call him. I didn't confront him. I thanked him warmly for handling things so carefully. His relief was visible, almost physical. He thought the last obstacle had been removed. That night, I laid everything out on my kitchen table. I aligned the documents by date. I noted where the language changed and who changed it. I tracked whose name appeared where and when it changed. Patterns emerged. This wasn't one isolated decision. It was a sequence, plan, a deliberate strategy, and I was going to prove it. Every instinct told me to confront him immediately, to expose what I'd found, to make him admit what he'd done and apologize. But I'd watched him long enough to know that emotion would only reinforce his narrative about me. If I got angry, I'd be emotional and unstable. If I cried, I'd be unstable and fragile. If I accused him, I'd be bitter and resentful about not being in charge. So I chose patience instead. I called him for coffee. I smiled at his jokes. I let him talk about his stress and his burden. I asked him how he was doing, what he was feeling, how he was handling the grief. I let him believe that I'd accepted the new order of things, that I'd given up, that he'd won completely. Internally, I was planning meticulously. I was waiting. I was thinking about timing constantly. Because I'd learned something important in the past month. Truth matters less than when you reveal it. A lie told at the right moment can last forever. But a lie exposed at exactly the right moment, when people are ready to hear it, can destroy everything. My brother was going to keep moving forward, getting more confident with each passing day, making bolder decisions, speaking with more authority. And I was going to let him, right up until the moment when denial became impossible for him. Not everyone was convinced by Alexander's version of events. Not everyone accepted his narrative completely. An aunt on my mom's side, Aunt Karen, hesitated during one conversation with Alexander about the will. She corrected herself mid-sentence, like she'd been about to say something but thought better of it. I didn't push. I didn't question her. I just listened carefully. Days later, she called me privately. "Something feels off about the way things happened," she said carefully, her voice uncertain. "Something doesn't add up." I didn't accuse Alexander. I didn't push her to choose sides. I just listened. When she asked directly what I thought, I answered her with facts only. No emotion. No accusations. Just clarity about what had happened. Then, and only then, I showed her a single document. Just one. A letter from the lawyer with dates that didn't match Alexander's timeline at all. Her expression changed immediately. She realized he'd lied. Not about everything maybe, but about enough. And that was the crack I needed. Truth doesn't need many allies. Needs the right ones. And I'd found my first. With Aunt Karen quietly on my side, with her as a witness, I felt something shift in the balance. But I didn't act on it yet. Instead, I watched Alexander make bigger moves. He started making decisions faster, speaking with more finality and authority. He began using words like "I've decided" instead of "we should discuss." He'd make announcements about Mom's things, about the apartment, about how her accounts would be handled, all without consulting anyone. People started noticing the shift, even if they didn't name it directly. I watched their faces change during conversations. The initial soft acceptance and sympathy started to feel like something else entirely. Something closer to discomfort. Something closer to doubt. He was overreaching. And overreach creates witnesses. Every new decision widened the gap between his version of fairness and reality. I documented every moment. I noted who looked uncomfortable. I watched who tried to speak up and then backed down. Silence can be measured. Discomfort leaves traces. And I was measuring everything. It happened during a family dinner about 6 weeks after the funeral. Someone, my cousin James, questioned Alexander directly about a decision he'd made regarding Mom's belongings. It was a small thing. Painting. Nothing major. But James asked clearly, "Why did you decide that without asking Natalie?" The room went absolutely still. No one had said that out loud before. They'd been thinking it clearly, but no one had voiced it. No one had challenged him. Alexander handled it smoothly because he was practiced at it. He smiled. He explained calmly. He made it sound like he'd consulted with me and I'd agreed. He was lying, and I could see the moment some people realized it. But they didn't push back. Not yet. After dinner, several people messaged me asking what I actually thought. What was my version? I answered carefully. Just facts. No accusations. No emotion. I said, I wasn't consulted about that decision. That simple sentence, true and calm, did more damage than any confrontation could have. Planted doubt. And once doubt existed, people started looking backward at everything else he'd done. Within days, contradictions started surfacing everywhere. Someone asked Alexander about a timeline he'd mentioned weeks earlier. His answer didn't match. He corrected himself too quickly, too smoothly, like he'd practiced multiple versions and picked the wrong one. That correction raised a new question. Someone else mentioned a detail he'd told them that contradicted something he'd told someone else. His confidence started to fracture visibly. I watched him lose control of the narrative inch by inch with each mistake. Each correction made him look worse, not better. Because every time he changed his story, it proved he'd been changing it all along, adapting it for different audiences. I didn't supply answers to people's questions. I just listened when they asked me what I remembered. I stood firm in my facts. I let silence do the work. And that silence was deafening. People were comparing notes without me, without my help, independently. They were realizing that his story didn't hold together. That moment, when the family started investigating him on their own, That was when I knew the balance had shifted permanently. It happened during a family Zoom call about Mom's apartment and what to do with it. Someone brought up a document they'd found, a letter from years before that outlined Mom's wishes clearly. Alexander hadn't known everyone had access to it. The language in the letter directly contradicted what he'd been telling us about Mom's intentions. The room went quiet. Not angry quiet. Discovery quiet. I watched his face carefully from the screen. He laughed it off at first, awkwardly. He said there must be confusion. But his laugh was too loud. His explanation was too quick. And it didn't match what the document actually said. I said nothing. I just let the silence exist. That silence was louder than anything I could have said. And in that silence, the first real crack appeared in his authority. Everything he'd built was starting to crumble. I could see him realizing it in real time. His hand moved to his face. His eyes shifted. He was calculating, trying to figure out how to spin this, how to explain it away. But there was no explanation that fit. The letter was dated. The handwriting was Mom's. The content was clear. He couldn't deny it. He couldn't reframe it. He couldn't charm his way out of it. For the first time I saw fear in his expression. Not angry fear. Panicked fear. The fear of someone who'd built a house of cards and just watched the wind pick up. After that document surfaced, memories shifted in people's minds. People started recalling moments they'd dismissed before. Comments he'd made. Decisions he'd made alone. Small discomforts they'd felt but ignored because grief had made them soft. "Wait," Aunt Karen said in a group chat. "Didn't you tell me something different about that 2 months ago?" Another cousin mentioned a decision Alexander had made without asking, which he'd later claimed we'd all agreed on together. Together, without me pushing anything, without me organizing it. These moments formed a pattern. Clear pattern. Pattern of manipulation. Alexander tried to regain control desperately. He sent long messages explaining himself. He reached out to people individually, trying to convince them. But every explanation contradicted another explanation he'd given. Every clarification raised a new question. Authority depends on trust. And trust was slipping away from him like water through his fingers. I watched this unfold from my apartment, reading the messages, seeing how people were finally connecting the dots themselves. I didn't have to say anything anymore. They were doing it for me. They were investigating. They were questioning. They were seeing through him. My silence had planted seeds, and now those seeds were growing into something he couldn't control. He tried to manage the narrative, but narratives have a way of escaping their keeper once enough people start pulling on the threads. Finally spoke. But I did it carefully. I didn't accuse. I didn't explain his motives. I didn't get emotional or theatrical. I simply laid out a sequence. Words. Documents. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing emotional. Just a clear alignment of facts that couldn't be disputed. Timeline of when he said what to whom. Documents that proved the timeline was accurate. Explanations that contradicted each other. I stopped talking before anyone could interrupt. The room stayed quiet. Not shocked quiet. Understanding quiet. When my brother tried to respond, when he tried to explain himself, his explanation didn't fit the structure I'd presented. Truth doesn't need defense when it's clear. Just exists. And suddenly everyone could see it. My voice had been quiet for so long that when I finally used it, the impact was devastating. Not because I was loud. 'Cause I was clear. Because every word was backed by evidence. Because I'd waited until the moment when people were ready to listen. This wasn't about winning an argument. This was about presenting reality in a way that couldn't be denied. And reality, when presented clearly and calmly, is more powerful than any emotional outburst could ever be. He denied it first. Then softened his denial. Then reframed it as misunderstanding. Each response contradicted the one before it. I watched people glance at each other, recognizing the pattern. This wasn't confusion. This was someone improvising, making things up on the spot. His voice tightened as he realized that control had slipped away completely. Someone asked a simple question he couldn't answer without unraveling everything. He paused. That pause lasted too long. That silence was damning. In that silence, more damage was done than any word could have caused. Lies collapse when they're forced to stand still. When they're questioned directly. When they have to explain themselves to people who are finally listening carefully. I saw him age in that moment. Not physically, but something inside him seemed to shrivel. The confidence was gone. The charm wasn't working anymore. The narrative he'd so carefully constructed was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He tried again, but his voice was different now. Smaller, weaker. People weren't buying it. They'd already made up their minds. The truth had landed, and there was no way to undo it. The questions shifted. They stopped asking me to explain myself. They started asking him to explain himself. Why didn't you tell Natalie about this decision? Why did you change the language in that document? Why did you make that announcement without consulting her? How could you do this? His answers didn't land anymore. They sounded defensive. They sounded like excuses. When he tried to blame me, to say I'd been too emotional, too distant, too unable to handle things, people didn't believe him. Because they'd seen the documents. They'd compared the timelines. They'd talked to me and found me calm, rational, and completely clear about what had happened. The story was over. He just didn't know it yet. I watched him try different tactics. Blame. Deflection. Excuse. Nothing worked. Every attempt to regain control only made things worse. It was like watching someone dig themselves deeper into a hole, refusing to acknowledge that they should stop digging. The more he tried to explain, the guiltier he looked. The more he defended himself, the more obvious his guilt became. There was no way out for him now. He'd had a chance to tell the truth, to apologize, to make things right. He'd chosen instead to lie and manipulate. And that choice had consequences. No one announced a verdict. They didn't stage a confrontation. There was no dramatic moment where they all turned against him. Instead, something quieter happened. He stopped being the center of decisions. Conversations stopped orbiting around him. When he suggested something, people paused before agreeing. Someone else offered to help handle things. People started asking me directly instead of going through him. I stayed composed through all of it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't push him further down. I just let the shift happen naturally. Authority doesn't shatter loudly. Drains. And his drained completely. What happened after wasn't dramatic. It was corrective. Documents were reviewed again with fresh eyes. Assumptions were questioned. Decisions were reconsidered. Roles quietly adjusted back into place. I didn't demand anything. I didn't push. I let accuracy do the work. People spoke to me directly again, not through Alexander. They asked me what I wanted. They consulted me about decisions. My place wasn't given back to me like a reward. It reappeared like it had never truly left. Like I'd never actually lost it. Only had it temporarily challenged. That was the cleanest form of vindication. Alexander withdrew. Not because anyone asked him to. Because he understood what had happened. He started speaking less in group conversations. He stopped making suggestions. He smiled without confidence behind it. Isolation isn't always exile. Sometimes it's simply being seen clearly. People were polite to him. They weren't cruel. But they were distant. He'd built his entire position on certainty, on authority, on being the person who had the answers. Once that cracked, there was nothing left to hold him up. Trust doesn't vanish loudly. Thins. Grows cold. There was no speech. No formal confrontation. No dramatic family meeting. Just a quiet series of conversations where things were put back where they belonged. Access was restored to me. Decisions started being made collectively. My voice was fully present again. Fully heard, fully respected. I didn't celebrate. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't even bring up what he'd done. I just existed as the person I'd always been, capable, reliable, deserving of a seat at the table. And no one questioned that anymore. Justice didn't arrive as punishment. It arrived as accuracy. Grief settled into something softer. Conversations returned to normal. Laughter came back cautiously. What happened wasn't erased. It was absorbed. I noticed how differently people looked at me now. Not with pity. Not with doubt. With respect. I'd survived something. I'd been right. I'd been patient. Those things had weight. I didn't carry anger forward. Carried clarity. That was my healing. Revenge would have been loud. This was better. This lasted. When everything was over, I realized something that changed how I understood everything. My place had never truly been taken. It had only been challenged. Silence had been mistaken for weakness. Patience had been misread as acceptance. Grief had been mistaken for permission. I stood exactly where I'd always belonged. Not because I won a fight, but because I never actually lost ground. I just let my brother think he had. While everyone mourned, he tried to rewrite me. He tried to tell a story where he was the capable one. But in the end, the truth edited him instead. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just completely. And I stood whole, unshaken, finally and fully seen. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need his acknowledgement. What I needed was already there. My voice restored, my integrity intact, my place in this family secured not through force but through truth. The family would move forward differently now. We'd learned something painful but valuable. Trust isn't given freely anymore. It has to be earned through honesty and respect. And I learned that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud or angry. It's simply being right, staying calm, and letting the truth speak for itself. That's a lesson Alexander would carry with him forever.